They thought she'd be easy to push out. Just another elderly black woman in a rent-controlled apartment. But they didn't count on her grandson. Because when they showed up with eviction papers, he didn't cry. He came back with a check, and made them pack their things instead. This is the story of how one man turned the eviction of his grandmother into the biggest power move of his life. Bernice Taylor has lived in the same Brooklyn apartment for 43 years. Same kitchen table where she taught her grandson to read chapter books during summer afternoons. Same view of the courtyard where 3 generations of kids learned to ride bikes, where she watched from her window making sure they wore their helmets. Same creaky floorboard by the front door that warned her when someone was coming up the stairs, a sound she'd learned to distinguish between the mailman's heavy boots, her neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez shuffling with her walker, and the quick steps of children racing home from school. At 82, Bernice still waters her plants every morning at exactly 7:30. African violets on the windowsill that have bloomed purple for 2 decades. The spider plant hanging in the corner that she started from a cutting her late husband James brought home from his job at the post office. She still hums the same hymns while she cooks. Amazing Grace while stirring grits. How great thou art while seasoning collard greens that smell like heaven and draw neighbors to her door asking for the recipe she's never written down because it lives in her hands, her heart, her memory of Sunday dinners when James was alive and the apartment was full of laughter. She still keeps photos of everyone she's ever loved on every surface. James in his army uniform, standing proud and young outside Fort Bragg before shipping to Vietnam. Marcus at his high school graduation, cap crooked and grin wide, the first person in their family to finish school. Church friends who've passed on but never left her heart. Sister Williams who taught her to crochet, Deacon Johnson who fixed her leaky faucet every winter for 15 years, Mother Jackson who held her hand during James's funeral and whispered prayers that carried her through the darkest months of grief. The building around her has changed. Young professionals moved in, bringing yoga mats and expensive coffee makers and complaints about the old pipes that make noise at night. Rent prices doubled, then tripled. The bodega on the corner became an organic market selling $15 smoothies. The community center where Marcus played basketball became luxury lofts with floor-to-ceiling windows that never show signs of life. But Bernice stayed. This wasn't just her apartment, it was her anchor in a world that seemed determined to wash away everything familiar. The walls held 4 decades of memories. The kitchen had fed 3 generations of neighborhood kids who knew they could knock on her door when they were hungry. The living room had hosted prayer circles and birthday parties and impromptu gatherings when people needed comfort, and Bernice's door was always open. Then came the knock. 3 men. Suits that screamed "we own things now," and shoes that had never walked on subway grates or waited for buses in the rain. The property manager had dead eyes and a clipboard thick with legal documents. Behind him, 2 investors who looked at her home like they were calculating square footage and profit margins, measuring doorways with their eyes and mentally stripping away wallpaper to reveal the potential underneath. "Mrs. Taylor, we need to discuss your lease." He pushed past her without waiting for permission, the way men do when they're used to being let into spaces whether they're welcome or not. Started scanning her apartment like an appraiser sizing up inventory. His fingers traced the crown molding James had painted 3 times over the years. His eyes lingered on the hardwood floors that still gleamed despite their age, the built-in bookshelves that housed her romance novels and James's mystery paperbacks and Marcus's old textbooks she couldn't bear to throw away. Building-wide renovations. Modernization project. "We're bringing this property into the 21st century. He said it like the 20th century had been a mistake. Like the life she'd built here was outdated, obsolete, ready for an upgrade. "You've got 30 days to vacate. We'll provide assistance with moving costs." Moving costs. Like 43 years could be reduced to hiring a truck and buying boxes. The paper felt heavy in her weathered hands. Legal words that meant one thing: get out. Make room for people who could pay 3 times what she'd been paying. People who wouldn't complain about renovations that lasted months. People who wouldn't remember when this was a neighborhood instead of an investment opportunity. 43 years I've been here," she said quietly, more to herself than to them. 43 years of rent paid on time, of taking care of an apartment like it was her own house, of being the unofficial building grandmother who held packages for working neighbors and kept spare keys for people who locked themselves out. The property manager was already heading for the door, checking his phone like he had 10 more stops to make, 10 more lives to append before lunch. "Nothing personal, ma'am. It's just progress." Progress. Like her life was something to be upgraded over. Like the community she'd helped build was standing in the way of something better. After they left, Bernice sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours without moving. The same table where she'd fed Marcus breakfast every morning after his parents split when he was 8 and the world became too much for a little boy to understand. Where she'd helped him with homework, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she sounded out math problems she'd never learned in her own truncated education, where she'd held him when he cried about kids at school calling him names, teaching him that other people's ignorance was their burden to carry, not his. The eviction notice lay in front of her like a death sentence. She read it 3 times, looking for loopholes, for mercy, for some acknowledgement that she was a human being and not just an obstacle to renovation. She found none. That evening, as the sun set behind buildings that seemed to grow taller every month, she called Marcus. Voice steady, she'd learned long ago not to burden the people she loved with her fear. Better to carry it herself than to pass it on like some inherited curse. But Marcus could hear it anyway. The tremor she was trying to hide. The way her voice caught on certain words. The silence that stretched too long between sentences. Marcus Taylor, 29. Freelance web developer living in Crown Heights in a trendy neighborhood 20 minutes away, but might as well be in another world. A world of craft cocktails and artisanal everything, where people complained about gentrification while being the reason neighborhoods changed, where everyone talked about authenticity but paid premium prices for the sanitized version of culture. He builds apps for startups run by kids fresh out of college with trust funds and big ideas about disrupting industries they don't understand. Designs websites for small businesses trying to compete with corporations that can undercut them at every turn. Makes decent money doing work that feels empty, solving problems that aren't really problems for people who've never had real problems. But he grew up in that apartment. After his parents split when he was 8, his father disappearing like morning mist, his mother drowning in her own grief and unable to care for a child who looked too much like the man who'd abandoned them both, Bernice became everything. Mother, father, best friend, disciplinarian, cheerleader, safe harbor in storms he was too young to understand but old enough to feel. She fed him. Not just food, though her cooking could heal heartbreak and celebrate victories with equal grace. She fed his curiosity, walking him to the library every Saturday and letting him check out as many books as he could carry. She fed his confidence, attending every school play and basketball game and science fair, cheering loud enough for both missing parents. She fed his sense of justice, teaching him that the world wasn't fair, but that didn't mean he had to accept unfairness when he had the power to change it. She kept him out of trouble when the streets were calling and gangs were recruiting, and it would have been easy to find belonging in dangerous places. Kept him focused on homework when education felt pointless and teachers looked at him like he was already a statistic. Kept him believing in himself when everything around him suggested boys who looked like him weren't meant for success. She taught him that home isn't just a place, it's the people who refuse to let you fall. Who catch you when you stumble. Who love you not because you've earned it, but because love is what family does. Marcus showed up that same evening, taking 2 trains and a bus because his car was in the shop and he couldn't wait for tomorrow to see his grandmother face the people trying to uproot her life. The property manager was still there, clipboard in hand, measuring walls like he was already counting profits. Taking photos of Bernice's family pictures like they were obstacles to remove, furniture to be disposed of, evidence of a life that needed clearing out. He had that particular brand of casual cruelty that comes from seeing people as problems to solve rather than human beings deserving respect. "This is my grandmother's home," Marcus said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a man who'd learned to navigate a world that questioned his right to exist in most spaces. The property manager barely looked up from his clipboard, the way people don't really see you when they've already decided you don't matter. "It's nothing personal, son. It's business. Business." Like Bernice was just another line item to be optimized. Like 43 years of memories could be calculated on a spreadsheet. Like the woman who'd raised him, who'd loved him unconditionally, who'd sacrificed pieces of herself to make sure he had chances she'd never had, was nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. Marcus looked around the apartment. At the hand-sewn quilts Bernice made during winter nights when arthritis kept her awake, and she channeled pain into something beautiful. At the Bible she read every morning. Pages soft from 40 years of turning, margins filled with notes in her careful handwriting, prayers, questions, conversations with God that sustained her through decades of joy and loss. At the windowsill garden where she grew herbs for neighbors who couldn't afford fresh groceries, sharing basil and thyme and wisdom with equal generosity. This wasn't business. This was war. "We'll fight this," Marcus told her after the men left. After the apartment fell quiet except for the familiar sounds of home, the refrigerator humming, the upstairs neighbor's television, the distant laughter of children who didn't yet know their world was changing around them. Bernice patted his hand with fingers worn smooth by decades of work, love, and service. "Baby, I'm tired. Maybe it's time." But Marcus wasn't tired. He was angry. The kind of anger that burns clean and bright, that transforms grief into action, that turns love into something powerful enough to move mountains, or at least move men in expensive suits who thought they could erase his grandmother's life with 30 days' notice. Marcus tried everything first. Because that's what good grandsons do. They exhaust every legal option before they get creative. They follow rules written by people who've never had their world threatened by clipboard-carrying strangers. They believe in systems that were never designed to protect people like their grandmothers. Tenant protection agencies that put him on hold for hours, transferring him through automated menus that led nowhere. When he finally reached human voices, they were tired voices, overworked advocates fighting battles they couldn't win with resources they didn't have. They took his information, promised someone would call back, added his grandmother's case to lists that grew longer every day as developers found new ways to push out long-time residents who couldn't afford to fight back. Legal aid lawyers who listened sympathetically, then explained why the eviction was technically legal even when it felt criminal. The law, they said, favored property owners over tenants, landlords over renters, capital over community. They could file paperwork, request extensions, delay the inevitable by weeks or maybe months, but ultimately, if the owner wanted everyone out for renovations, the law was on their side. Justice and legality, he learned, weren't the same thing. City council hotlines where recorded voices promised help that would never come. Housing advocates who told him horror stories about landlords who'd found loopholes to push out rent-stabilized tenants. Developers who specialized in displacing communities, who had lawyers and accountants and strategies refined over decades of turning neighborhoods into profit centers. Everyone said the same thing: we understand your frustration, but the law is the law. The law. Written by people who'd never had to choose between rent and groceries. Enforced by people who'd never watched their grandmother pack up a lifetime of memories into cardboard boxes. Interpreted by judges who lived in houses they owned, in neighborhoods where gentrification was something that happened to other people. Marcus spent 3 weeks fighting the system. 3 weeks of phone calls and paperwork and meetings in fluorescent-lit offices where bureaucrats shuffled forms and offered sympathy instead of solutions. 3 weeks of being told that displacement was regrettable but legal, that progress required sacrifice, that his grandmother's 43 years of residency meant less than the property owner's right to maximize profit. 3 weeks watching Bernice slowly surrender. She started packing. Not fast. She couldn't bear to rush through 43 years of life. But every day, another box. Family photos wrapped in newspaper, each one a moment preserved in time. Church programs from funerals of friends, baptisms of babies she'd watched grow up, weddings where she'd cried happy tears and danced until her feet hurt. Letters from James during his deployment, still smelling faintly of his cologne after all these years, words of love that had sustained her through lonely nights and continued to comfort her decades after his voice had gone silent. She still hummed those hymns while she packed. But quieter now, like she was trying not to disturb the grief settling into every corner of the apartment. Precious Lord while folding quilts. Blessed Assurance while wrapping dishes. Songs that had carried her through previous losses, that reminded her of church services where the community lifted voices together and troubles seemed smaller when shared. "Where will you go?" Marcus asked one evening, finding her in the bedroom she'd shared with James, where his side of the closet still held clothes she couldn't bring herself to donate because they smelled like home and permanence and the life they'd built together. "Your cousin Diane says I can stay with her in Queens. Just temporarily, until I figure something out." Temporarily. At 82. Starting over in a spare bedroom in a house that would never feel like home, dependent on relatives who were kind but busy with their own lives, their own struggles, their own families that filled every corner of space and conversation. Bernice had lived independently for 8 decades. Had raised children, buried a husband, survived losses that would have broken weaker people. Had been the rock others leaned on, the safe harbor in family storms, the grandmother who always had solutions and comfort and an extra plate at dinner. Now she was supposed to become someone's houseguest, grateful for charity, careful not to overstay her welcome in spaces that belonged to other people. One night, Marcus sat in his car outside the building, engine off, windows down. The autumn air carried the smell of someone cooking dinner, the sound of music from open windows, voices calling good night as people headed home from work. Life continuing while his grandmother's world was being erased by men who'd never walked these streets, never knew the names of children who played in the courtyard, never understood that community was something built over decades and destroyed in 30 days. He remembered being 17. Got arrested for trespassing, wrong place, wrong time, wrong color skin in a neighborhood where people like him were automatically suspicious. Standing on a corner waiting for a friend when police decided he looked threatening. Handcuffed and processed and charged with loitering with intent, which seemed to mean existing while black in a space where his presence made white people uncomfortable. The public defender was overworked and uninterested. The private lawyer wanted $5,000 up front, more money than Marcus had ever seen in one place. His mother was working 2 jobs just to pay rent and couldn't help. His father was long gone, a ghost who'd left nothing but absence and anger. Marcus had $37 and a Metro card, facing 6 months in jail or a felony conviction that would follow him forever. Bernice sold her late husband's watch. James's watch, the only thing she had left of him besides photos and memories. A simple Timex he'd worn every day of their 30-year marriage, that still ticked steadily though he'd been gone for 15 years. She'd kept it in her jewelry box, wound it every Sunday, held it sometimes when loneliness felt too heavy to carry alone. She walked into a pawn shop in a neighborhood where she had to take 3 buses to get there, where the owner looked at her like she was trying to steal something instead of sell something precious. Got $200 for a watch worth 1,000 memories. Used that money and her grocery budget and the small savings she kept for emergencies to hire a lawyer who got the charges dropped. Never mentioned the sacrifice. Never made Marcus feel guilty. Never said she'd given up the last physical connection to her dead husband to save her living grandson. Just did what family does when someone you love needs saving. If money talks, he told himself, staring up at her lit window where she was probably packing another box, humming another hymn, preparing for another loss, then I'll speak their language. He opened his laptop and started planning. Marcus had been working on an idea for months. Not for investors, just for himself. Something that felt real in a world of apps designed to solve problems rich people didn't actually have. A hyperlocal platform connecting gig workers with elderly tenants. Help with groceries when arthritis made shopping painful. Technology troubleshooting for people who'd lived full lives before smartphones existed. Small repairs for tenants whose landlords ignored maintenance requests until pipes burst or heat failed. Simple. Community-focused. Built around the idea that neighborhoods worked best when people took care of each other instead of treating each other like strangers. Nothing revolutionary. Nothing that would make him rich or get him featured in tech magazines or invited to conferences where entrepreneurs talked about changing the world while ignoring the communities outside their office windows. But it was genuine. It solved real problems for real people. It could work. Now it might be his grandmother's lifeline. Marcus started hustling with the desperation of someone watching his family's world collapse in real time. Cold emails to every venture capital firm in New York, personalizing each message with research about their portfolios, their stated missions, their claimed commitment to social impact. Mock-ups built during sleepless nights fueled by coffee and the kind of focused energy that comes from having no choice but to succeed. He reached out to college friends who'd made it in tech, asking for introductions they probably wouldn't make, favors they might not remember owing. Most had moved to San Francisco or Seattle, chasing stock options and signing bonuses, building products for people exactly like themselves while convincing themselves they were changing the world. Their responses were polite but distant. Interesting concept. Keep me posted on your progress. Let's grab coffee next time I'm in New York. The language people use when they want to sound supportive without offering actual support. Marcus wasn't surprised. He'd learned early that the people who talked loudest about disruption and innovation were usually the least interested in solutions that didn't scale to millions of users or generate billions in revenue. They wanted to fix problems that were sexy and scalable, not problems that were local and human. Tech bros who talked about making the world a better place while building platforms that made rich people richer and everyone else more isolated. Who lived in cities they were busy destroying, pricing out the communities that had made those cities interesting in the first place. Most ignored him. Some replied with form letters about keeping applications on file and interesting concepts that don't align with our current investment thesis. Translation: your problem isn't big enough, your market isn't rich enough, your solution doesn't scale in ways that generate the kind of returns that justify our attention. Then he found Elevation Capital, a small black-owned venture firm in Manhattan, operating out of a converted brownstone in Harlem instead of a glass tower in Midtown. Their website didn't feature photos of founders posing with expensive cars or talking about disrupting industries they'd never worked in. Instead, it showed real businesses they'd funded, an app connecting home healthcare workers with elderly clients, a platform helping immigrants send money home without predatory fees, a service matching formerly incarcerated people with employers willing to give them second chances. Companies that solved real problems for people who usually got ignored by the tech industry. The partner, Keisha Williams, agreed to meet. Something about his pitch email caught her attention. Maybe it was the honesty. Maybe it was the way he led with his grandmother's story instead of market research and growth projections. Maybe it was the fact that he mentioned love as a business motivation, which probably violated every rule of startup communications but felt more authentic than anything she'd read in months. Her office was small. No ping-pong tables or kombucha on tap or walls covered with awards and magazine covers. Just real people trying to fund real solutions for communities that venture capital usually overlooked. The kind of problems that mattered more than they scaled, that changed lives even if they didn't change the world. "Walk me through the concept," she said, settling back in a chair that looked comfortable instead of designed to impress. Marcus explained the app. The market need he'd identified through watching his grandmother navigate aging in a community that was slowly being stripped of resources. The revenue model that prioritized sustainability over explosive growth. The user experience designed for people who hadn't grown up with smartphones but needed technology to work for them instead of against them. All the startup language he taught himself from YouTube videos and blog posts and books about launching companies without trust funds or connections or safety nets. But then he stopped. Looked at Keisha, really looked at her. Saw something familiar in her eyes. The recognition of someone who understood that business wasn't just about profit, that success meant more than returns on investment, that some problems were worth solving even if they didn't make you rich. "Can I tell you why I really need this funding?" She nodded. Marcus told her about Bernice. About the eviction notice and the 30 days and the 43 years of life being reduced to cardboard boxes. About watching his grandmother, the strongest person he'd ever known, slowly accepting that she was going to lose the only home she'd ever chosen for herself. About feeling helpless in a system that treated elderly black women like obstacles to progress instead of human beings deserving dignity and stability. About wanting to build something that would prevent other families from going through what his was experiencing. Keisha was quiet for a long moment, looking out her window at the street below where people were walking home from work, carrying groceries, living lives that continued despite the forces trying to reshape their neighborhood around them. "Where did your grandmother live?" she asked. Marcus gave her the address. "I grew up 6 blocks from there," Keisha said. "My grandmother got pushed out in 2018. Same story. Same developers, probably. Same 30 days notice after 40 years of paying rent on time and taking care of a place like it was her own home." She understood. Not theoretically, not as a business opportunity, but personally. The way you understand something when it's happened to your own family, when you've watched someone you love lose everything they couldn't afford to replace. What happened to her? "She moved in with my aunt in Brooklyn. Died 8 months later. I think her heart broke when she lost her home. Like something fundamental got disconnected and she couldn't figure out how to plug back in." They both sat with that for a moment. The weight of what happens when community gets commodified, when homes become investments, when the people who built neighborhoods get priced out of their own lives. "How much do you need for the app?" $50,000 for MVP development. Another $20,000 for user acquisition. Maybe $30,000 more for the first year of operations. "What's your timeline?" 6 months to launch if everything goes perfectly. 9 months more realistically. "And your grandmother has 30 days. 26 now." Keisha leaned forward. "What if I told you we don't typically fund apps?" Marcus felt his heart drop. Another polite rejection dressed up as encouragement. "We fund solutions," she continued. "And sometimes the solution isn't the product you're pitching. Sometimes it's something bigger." "I don't understand. How much would it cost to buy your grandmother's building?" Marcus blinked. That wasn't a question he'd expected. "I don't know. I never thought. Probably 800,000? Maybe $1 million? Way more than I could ever." "What if you could?" "Could what?" "Buy the building. Keep your grandmother in her home. Turn it into the kind of place that actually serves the community instead of displacing it." Marcus stared at her. "That's not how venture capital works." "Says who?" "We fund solutions that scale. This could scale. Community ownership instead of predatory investment. Affordable housing that stays affordable. Technology that connects neighbors instead of isolating them. Your app becomes the operating system for a different kind of real estate model. You're serious. We don't typically do real estate investments, she said. But we don't typically meet founders with this kind of motivation either. And we've been looking for ways to fund community-controlled development that doesn't require displacing the people who made communities worth investing in. I don't know anything about owning property. You know about building community. You know about taking care of people. You know about technology. We know about financing and legal structures and making sure good intentions turn into sustainable business models. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Hope, maybe. Or just the possibility of hope, which was more than he'd felt in weeks. How would this work? We provide bridge financing for the property acquisition. You develop the app as planned, but it becomes the platform for tenant services in your building. You prove the model works at small scale, then we help you expand it to other community-owned properties. Instead of displacing people, we create a system for keeping them housed while building wealth in their own neighborhoods. And my grandmother gets to stay home, becomes your first customer, helps you understand what elderly tenants actually need instead of what young developers think they need. That night, Marcus called Bernice, told her to stop packing. Told her he had an idea that might sound crazy but could work. Told her he loved her and she wasn't going anywhere. For the first time in weeks, she laughed. Really laughed, the way she used to when Marcus was small, and said something that surprised her with its sweetness or wisdom or pure audacity. Baby, she said, crazy ideas are the only ones worth trying. Marcus spent the next 2 weeks learning everything he could about real estate law, property management, and cooperative ownership structures. Laws written by and for people who own things, designed to protect capital investment over community stability, but also loopholes, opportunities, ways that money could be used to preserve instead of displace. He discovered that the building was in escrow but hadn't closed yet. The investor group was still finalizing paperwork, probably getting their financing in order to renovate and flip individual units into luxury condos. They had 60 days to complete the purchase, which meant Marcus had maybe 40 days to put together a competing offer. 40 days to save his grandmother's home and maybe figure out a way to save everyone else's too. Keisha connected him with a lawyer who specialized in community development, a woman named Sarah Chun who'd helped organize tenant cooperatives in San Francisco before moving to New York to do the same work in neighborhoods where gentrification was still early enough to fight. Your grandmother's building is perfect for this, she told him over coffee in a shop that used to be a laundromat where Bernice had done her washing for 20 years before the owner retired, and rent got too expensive for anything that wasn't artisanal. 12 units, mostly long-term tenants, decent bones. The current owner is probably looking to get out before major repairs become necessary. Marcus learned that Solomon Rosen had owned the building for 30 years. His family had immigrated from Poland in the 1940s, bought property in Brooklyn when it was affordable, slowly built wealth that let them move to better neighborhoods while keeping their investments in communities they no longer lived in but still depended on for income. Not evil, exactly. Not the predatory developers who swooped in with plans to demolish and rebuild. Just an elderly man who wanted to simplify his life and didn't think much about what that simplification meant for people like Bernice. He might be willing to negotiate, Sarah said, especially if you can match the investor group's offer and present a vision that honors what the building has been instead of erasing it. Marcus got creative with funding. Keisha's firm provided bridge financing, not a loan exactly, but an investment in the community ownership model they were trying to develop. Marcus would own the building initially, but with legal structures in place to gradually transition ownership to a tenant cooperative where longtime residents like Bernice would become shareholders instead of renters. He maxed out credit cards he barely used, borrowed against future freelance contracts, convinced his bank to extend a line of credit based on the income he'd been generating and the property he was about to own, called in favors from college friends who were making good money in tech, asking for personal loans he promised to pay back with interest once the building was generating rental income. Financial engineering that felt terrifying and necessary in equal measure. When he had enough for a competitive bid, he called Solomon Rosen directly instead of going through real estate agents who saw every transaction as an opportunity to maximize their commission regardless of human cost. Mr. Rosen, my name is Marcus Taylor. My grandmother lives in your building on Atlantic Avenue. I'd like to talk to you about purchasing the property. Silence on the other end of the line. Then, you want to buy the building? Yes, sir. I can match whatever offer you've received, and I'd like to explain why I think you might want to sell to me instead. They met the next day at a coffee shop in Park Slope, halfway between Marcus's apartment and Solomon's house in a neighborhood that had been Jewish and Italian when he was young and was now populated by families who paid more for rent than his parents had paid for their mortgage. Solomon was 78, with hands marked by decades of maintenance work on properties he'd owned across Brooklyn. He'd been a landlord back when being a landlord meant fixing things yourself, knowing your tenants' names, showing up when pipes burst or heat failed instead of hiring management companies to handle problems from a distance. "Tell me about your grandmother," he said. Marcus told him about Bernice, about 43 years of on-time rent payments and taking care of the apartment like it was her own home, about feeding neighborhood kids and holding packages for working neighbors and being the kind of tenant who made buildings feel like communities instead of just collections of strangers paying to sleep in the same structure, about the eviction notice and the 30 days and the way displacement could kill people slowly, stealing not just their homes but their sense of belonging in a world that kept changing around them. "I grew up in that building," Marcus said. "My grandmother raised me there after my parents split. I learned to ride a bike in that courtyard, did homework at that kitchen table, had my first job interview in a suit she bought me with grocery money because she believed I could become something better than what the neighborhood expected from boys who looked like me." Solomon listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, the old man sat quietly for a long moment, stirring coffee that had probably gone cold while family history got shared across a small table in a chain restaurant that used to be somebody's neighborhood diner. "I've owned that building for 30 years, Solomon finally said. "Watched families grow up, move out, move back in with children of their own. Your grandmother, she's been there the longest. Always pays on time, never complains, takes better care of her apartment than some people take care of houses they own. She's special. They're all special. Mrs. Rodriguez on the second floor, she's been there almost as long. Has pictures of every kid in the building from when they were babies. Mr. Washington in 3A, he fixes everyone's electronics for free, just because he likes helping people. The young couple in 2B, they're teachers, work with special needs kids, come home exhausted every day but still have energy to help elderly neighbors with groceries." Solomon had been a landlord for 30 years, but he'd also been part of a community. He knew his tenants not as rent checks, but as human beings building lives in spaces he provided. "The investor group," Marcus said. "What did they tell you they were planning?" "Gut renovations. Convert to luxury condos. Market rate units starting at $4,000 a month." Solomon's voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what those words meant for people who currently paid $800. "They showed me architectural plans. Very impressive. Very expensive. Very empty of everything that makes the building feel like home. And what do you want to see happen?" "I want to retire, son. I want to stop worrying about boiler repairs and roof leaks and tenant complaints. I want to simplify my life." He paused. "But I don't want to destroy other people's lives in the process." Marcus pulled out his phone, showed Solomon the mock-ups for his app, explained the community ownership model, the plan to keep long-time tenants in place while making necessary improvements, the vision of technology that connected neighbors instead of isolating them, that helped elderly residents age in place instead of forcing them into institutional care they couldn't afford. "I can't pay more than the investor group offered," Marcus said. "But I can promise you that your building will continue to be home for people who've made it home. And I can promise that whatever profit it generates will go back into the community instead of into some developer's portfolio." Solomon was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "My parents lost everything in the war. Came here with nothing, worked factory jobs, saved every dollar they could, bought their first property when I was 12. Told me real estate was the only wealth that couldn't be taken away, that land was security in a world that taught us security was temporary." He looked out the window at the street where people were walking home from work, carrying groceries, living lives that continued despite the forces trying to reshape their neighborhood around them. "But I learned something my parents didn't know when they came here. Wealth that requires other people's poverty isn't wealth. It's just cruelty with a profit margin." 2 days later, Marcus got a call from Solomon's lawyer. The building was his. The investor group showed up the following Monday to finalize their paperwork. Found out escrow had been canceled. Called their lawyer, threatened to sue for breach of contract, demanded to know how they'd been outbid when their offer was the highest on record. Too late. The building belonged to Marcus now, and with it, the responsibility of proving that community ownership could work without displacing the community it was meant to serve. That afternoon, Marcus walked into the storefront office the investor group had rented to coordinate their neighborhood revitalization project. A temporary space in what used to be a small grocery store where Bernice had shopped for decades before the owner retired, and couldn't find anyone willing to take over a business that served the community instead of extracting wealth from it. 3 men in.